Do you remember when audiobooks were on cassette? You would go to the bookstore and there would be an audiobook section and you'd find these big, chunky, colourful boxes with hefty price tags. Now, back in the day, being able to get one of these cassette collections was a real treat. I could often leave the bookstore with an armful of paperbacks, but those audiobooks in cassette form, they were really special, and I would always load up on a few. If there was a long journey ahead of me, I would even look forward to long road trips, long train trips, because you could pop one of those cassettes in and be told a story, and the journey would pass like that. And the radio used to be much better. I remember Sunday afternoons spent trying to record radio dramas, radio plays, and put them onto my own cassette to play back later. The quality would always be horrendous and you'd have already listened to the story whilst trying to record, but it was good fun. And today we don't really get that. We don't get the long form content like we used to. We're inundated by visual media and we're bombarded by short visual media. Our attention spans, contrary to common opinion, actually haven't diminished, but the duration of much of our entertainment has. Although we are seeing a bit of a cultural pushback, we're seeing a deep desire for the long form, long stories with multiple narrative arcs that take a very long time to get through. We're coming back to a deep appreciation of that because we've experienced the opposite. We've experienced the frivolous, the dispensable, the throwaway, and we want something significant. So I cast my mind back to those cassettes and I feel a really warm sense of nostalgia. And I loved the whole ritual of popping in a cassette, getting to the end of it, fishing the next one out. I loved it so much that for a very long time I thought I would specifically take a job that would enable me to listen to as many of those cassettes, as many of those audiobooks as possible. And then we started moving away from the analog and the digital revolution dawned. And so collectively we moved away from cassettes and radio dramas to digital downloads and streaming, and we moved towards the Audible credit system. And as would come as a surprise to absolutely nobody, I'm somebody who always maxes out their credits and needs to buy more every month. I'm a little bit of an audiophile. I'm addicted to audiobooks and also music. And the reason I'm thinking about all of this and going down memory lane is because recently I've received a lot of questions asking me if I think audiobooks count. Do audiobooks count as reading? It's a very common question. A lot of people who ask me this question seem to think I'm going to say no, they don't count as reading. Now, if what we're actually asking is, are they the same thing? Is listening to an audiobook the same as reading a physical book? Then the answer objectively is no. They're two different things. Reading and listening are two different processes. They're different input methods. However, I think what people are actually asking most of the time, what they're actually trying to obtain is a value judgment. The real question is one better than another? Is listening to an audiobook an inferior method of consuming one's narratives, consuming one's stories? And my first thought when somebody asks if reading a physical book is better than listening to an audiobook, my first thought is, well, better for what exactly? Whilst I would say that listening to a book and reading a book are two different things, I would contest that they are both incredibly and equally valuable. If someone were to say that listening to an audiobook didn't count as real reading, I would immediately think, well, that sucks for most readers over the course of history, because this was how we consumed our stories. Now, we might not want to call it reading per se, but for the longest time we consumed our stories by hearing them. We were told stories, or we would tell stories to another. The idea of the solitary reader, reading by themselves, not even sub-vocalizing, in solitude and quiet, I love that idea. I am a solitary reader myself. Being an introvert, I absolutely love retreating somewhere alone with a book and spending time in the company of fictional people and in fictional surroundings. I absolutely adore that. But the idea of the solitary reader is a very recent phenomenon when it comes to literature, the history of literature. And even many modern and postmodern narratives reflect the fact that we come from an oral tradition. If you take a book like Ulysses, there's an incredible section which takes place in a hospital. And as you might know, James Joyce utilised different aesthetic techniques for different sections of his book. And in that section of the book, the aesthetic technique was embryonic development. And it's a really exhilarating experience because over the course of that chapter, you experience the growth of the English language. James Joyce moves from our Anglo-Saxon alliterative, poetic heritage and moves down through the ages. And that's a really exhilarating thing to experience. But you need to experience it read aloud. And whether you read that section, or indeed whether you read all of Ulysses aloud or listen to it read aloud, that's up to you. But one cannot deny that reading that modern work aloud unlocks its meaning and is exactly how James Joyce wanted us to experience it. There's a lot of talk of cultural inclusivity when it comes to reading, but something really interesting that I learnt from a lady who undertook a project to read around the world. She wanted to read a book from every single country. One of the major difficulties was her discovering that many of these cultures aren't glided over or ignored today because of a prejudice, but rather because they are still rooted in an oral tradition. And there are many cultures today that still pass on their stories by word of mouth. And when I find myself listening to a story, enjoying the process of being told a story, I am constantly reminded of the fact that for the longest time, how I'm enjoying the story would have been once the only way to have enjoyed a story. Yes, there were scholars who could read and write and translate, but they were in the minority. And most people, for the longest time, couldn't read, couldn't write, but they most certainly could listen and they could attend performances. And one of the phenomenal things about Samuel Richardson's Clarissa is that it is a landmark work because we can mark the shift from a culture primarily rooted in an oral tradition towards that solitary reader who is seeing the characters and seeing the scene in their mind's eye. The rise of the novel in English literature specifically is the rise of the solitary reader, the solitary individual, and that's one of the reasons why it is so fascinating to read Richardson and to mark what came before, to mark Defoe, to mark his contemporaries, Henry Fielding, and to mark what came afterwards. And what came afterwards was enjoyed in a performative sense too. Yes, we started reading by ourselves, but we never lost that desire to share what we were reading with other people. I think of the Brontë sisters and their childhood and how they would have read the poems of Lord Byron aloud together, how they would have enjoyed the popular novels of their day and they would have put on performances, they would have read them aloud together. I think of Charles Dickens. Dickens was a mega success, a best-selling author in his lifetime. Like Shakespeare, he was popular culture and he continues to be popular culture. When the ship containing the latest instalment of the Old Curiosity Shop arrived at the dock, there were crowds of people. There were so many people that some people unfortunately were bustled into the water and died. People were waiting on Dickens's every word. He could pack theatre halls, he could pack out halls where he would perform his stories, and apparently, according to biographer Hesketh Pearson, watching Dickens would have been like watching Shakespeare if Shakespeare could have given life to each and every single character, because Dickens could make every single character have their own distinct voice. We're never going to see anything quite like that ever again. Readers voraciously devoured the works of Charles Dickens, but how did they consume them? Yes, there would have been some people who would have consumed the latest issue of All the Year Round, the serialised issue, the latest chapter of Great Expectations. Some would have enjoyed that by themselves, but most readers would have taken that copy home to their family, and in the evening they would have gathered around and they would have read the story aloud, and they would have listened to one of the family members reading it aloud to them. And so literature was communal, and it was rooted in the oral tradition, and it took on greater meaning, it took on greater relevance for the lives of the readers. It came alive. So in the Hardcore Literature Book Club, when readers follow, for example, George Eliot's original serialised publication schedule for her masterpiece Middlemarch, when readers discuss the latest events with one another, readers are connecting with those first readers, and they are connecting with a spirit of storytelling that is as natural to us as breathing, a spirit of storytelling that has only recently started to be subverted and pushed down, but we are experiencing a renaissance in regards to reconnecting with the oral tradition. The audiobook argument also reminds me of a similar argument when it comes to dramatic literature and plays, the plays of William Shakespeare, for example. One of the common questions for readers coming to Shakespeare is whether it is best to read the plays or see them performed. Are Shakespeare's plays performance or poetry? And though I have ebbed back and forth on this over the years, my current response today would be, why not both? If we take an example of what I believe to be Shakespeare's best play, Hamlet, the tragedy of the Prince of Denmark, seeing a good performance of Hamlet, whilst difficult, because it's a difficult play to perform, if you are able to see a good performance of Hamlet, it is an absolute treat. It is a feast, and it will prove to be unforgettable. And the same is true for King Lear, the same is true for Macbeth or Henry IV, the same is true for whatever play you fall in love with. But with something like Hamlet, I will never be convinced that Shakespeare designed that play to be performance only. Performance, yes, but poetry too. And he designed that work to be mulled over, to be meditated upon. He designed that work to be read in a physical book. My copy of Hamlet never leaves my bedside, and after years and years of rereading, I'm always finding new things. There's no way that one could pay their penny at the Globe, muck in and stand in the pit and watch a performance and get everything they possibly could out of that play in those hours of performance. One is supposed to read it, read around it, write around it, return to it, and yes, see it performed and discuss it, but read it too, because it is poetry. It's also philosophy, and yes, it's performance. For years, I've personally favoured a hybrid approach. Yes, there's great joy in taking an audiobook on a long hike and listening only to the audiobook, but it's also immensely pleasurable to listen and read at the same time. Listen and read simultaneously, and new meaning undoubtedly will be unlocked for you if the work is truly great. I remember doing this with George Saunders's Lincoln in the Bardo. There's a really impressive multi-cast audiobook production. Reading along and listening gifted me so much more meaning than if I had just read the book or just listened to the audiobook. When it comes to any difficult work, my go-to advice is to do exactly this. Adopt a hybrid approach. Whether we're talking about James Joyce's Ulysses, Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, Samuel Richardson's Clarissa, whatever it might be, a hybrid approach will be so rewarding. Because there is a difference. When somebody voices the words that are on the page, they are no longer relegated to the page, they come alive. You can hear the different character voices, you can hear the rhythm, and you can hear meaning. Very often, meaning, especially in a difficult text, written down will go right over our heads, but will be unlocked immediately when we hear it voiced. This is the benefit of listening to or attending lectures as well. Many lecturers are also writers. They'll put their ideas down in their books, but I have personally managed to understand some fairly difficult concepts swiftly by listening to the concept explained. Now, you can use a hybrid approach as well. You can write down your ideas, you can follow along with the text, but that listening truly does unlock meaning. There is a world of difference in reading Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces and listening to Joseph Campbell give a lecture. Again, it's not an either or, they're complementary and one should embrace both. Sometimes when this topic comes up, so does the discussion of different learner styles. One of my favourite psychological theories of learning is Gardner's multiple intelligences model. And whilst there are compelling claims that this theory has been debunked, I find there is still some value in the model that different people learn differently. I'm primarily a visual learner, I know that from experience, but I still enjoy listening to content, listening to learning material, but others will gravitate towards learning through listening. There is one specific area where I most certainly would insist on reading over listening, but that's not to say they're mutually exclusive, you can still utilize both. But I would say when it comes to philosophy, when it comes to reading Plato's Republic, when it comes to reading Aristotle, I strongly believe that you should be sitting down at a table with a pen and a pad of paper and the book open before you. But then one might question whether that's reading or whether that's work. Whilst I like to be prescriptive, I'm not much of a purist, and I strongly believe that whatever gets the story, whatever gets the ideas, whatever gets the content into your mind, whatever gets you engaged is the correct approach for you. However you're able to get into the work before you, you should utilize that method. And ultimately, there are few joys quite like the joy of being told a good story. Anyways, those are just some of my thoughts on the matter, but I would really like to hear from you. Do you listen to audiobooks? Do you read more than you listen? Do you do both? Which one do you prefer and why? Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a lovely day and happy reading, everybody. Bye-bye for now.